Uncle Mike's Story Corner. All right, this is, I guess the title of it would be The Arab-Israeli War 50 years ago brought us closer to nuclear Armageddon. The Israel-Hamas war coincides with the 50th anniversary of the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, also known as the Yom Kippur War. But as the Biden administration scrambles to prevent the fighting from escalating into a broader conflict, it is often forgotten just how close the Yom Kippur War brought the world to nuclear war. The 1973 war began on the morning of October 6, when Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated surprise attack against Israel, not unlike the attack by Hamas on Israel this past weekend. The United States was caught off guard, too. President Nixon, who was ensnared at the time in the Watergate scandal, said later, quote, "The news of the attack on Israel took us completely by surprise. As recently as the day before, the CIA had reported that war in the Middle East was unlikely," end quote. The conflict soon became a proxy war between Egypt's principal backer, the Soviet Union, and Israel's patron, the United States. Things became so dire that U.S. global forces went to a DEFCON 3 alert, the highest state of peacetime readiness, reflecting the risk of nuclear confrontation with the Soviets. Paragliders flew into Israel. A similar attack happened 35 years ago. The 1973 nuclear alert is one of the overlooked stories of the Cold War, according to James Acton, a co-director of the Nuclear Policy Program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He called it, quote, "probably the most dangerous moment," end quote, of the second half of the Cold War. 50 years later, the facts and the intelligence about Soviet actions that led Secretary of State Henry Kissinger to push for the DEFCON 3 alert remain fuzzy, as does the matter of whether the alert was warranted. Military analyst and historian Michael Hanlon at the Brookings Institution said, quote, "I think Kissinger's decision to call for the DEFCON alert was a very questionable move," end quote. Timothy Naftali, a research scholar at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, agreed. He said, quote, "Kissinger got the situation wrong. I think Kissinger panicked. He thought he had the Israelis, the Soviets, and the Egyptians under control," end quote. The DEFCON alert system was created by the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1959 to provide the United States military with a uniform system of progressive readiness conditions after a communications foul-up during a joint American-Canadian exercise. 5 DEFCON levels were established. DEFCON 1 meant imminent war. DEFCON 5 indicates normal peacetime conditions. A DEFCON 3, or a so-called roundhouse alert, calls for the Air Force, including the strategic bomber crews and missile operators at the Strategic Air Command, to be prepared to mobilize in 15 minutes to deliver a nuclear strike. The first use of the DEFCON system and the first DEFCON 3 alert took place in May 1960 during the U-2 spy plane crisis, after Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev stormed out of a Paris summit with President Dwight Eisenhower and sparked fears of an attack on the United States or Europe. The 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis triggered a DEFCON 2. The only other DEFCON 3 alert came after the terrorist attack on the United States on September 11th, 2001. But what exactly were the Soviets planning in October 1973? That was not clear. 50 years later, it still isn't. A few days into that war, Kissinger, who had become Secretary of State just weeks before, Kissinger proposed that the United States and the USSR jointly call for an end to the fighting and return to the ceasefire lines established after the 1967 war. Leonid Brezhnev, the volatile Soviet premier, agreed, but Egyptian President Anwar Sadat rejected the proposal, hoping to avoid an Arab defeat, Moscow began to supply Egypt and Syria with arms. The United States responded with a massive airlift of tanks, bombs, and materiel to Israel. The Yom Kippur War now had taken on the additional dimensions of a proxy war between the United States and the Soviet Union, straining the détente that had been Nixon's greatest foreign policy achievement. Meanwhile, the tide of the war turned irrevocably against the Arabs. On October 16th of that year, Israeli forces under the command of General Ariel Sharon crossed the Suez Canal and were advancing on Cairo. The war was not going any better for Egypt's Syrian allies as Israeli troops reached the outskirts of Damascus. Now, President Sadat began to show interest in a ceasefire, leading Brezhnev to invite Kissinger to Moscow, where they quickly drew up a framework for a cessation of hostilities. Next, Kissinger flew to Tel Aviv, where the Israeli government agreed to the terms. However, when Kissinger arrived back in D.C. on October 23rd, he learned that the ceasefire had already been broken, and the Israeli army was threatening to destroy the besieged Egyptian army. Still, Kissinger did not seem too perturbed. He told his State Department staff that evening, quote, "Today there is a little flap. The major thing to remember is that the events of the last 2 weeks have been on the whole a major success for the United States and for the policy have escalated." Then things escalated. As Israeli forces continued to advance into Egyptian territory, the alarmed Soviets informed the White House that they intended to introduce a United Nations Security Council resolution calling for both the USSR and the United States to dispatch military contingents to the Middle East battleground to enforce the ceasefire. Things were definitely falling apart now. Kissinger made clear that the United States would veto such a resolution and would not tolerate outside military forces in the region. He saw the move as a strategy to shore up the Kremlin's waning influence with its Arab allies, while Nixon was embroiled in Watergate. On the night of October 24th of that year, the Soviet ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Dobrynin, called Kissinger to tell him that he had an urgent letter from Brezhnev. Kissinger wrote later, quote, "It was in effect an ultimatum," end quote. The letter called for joint U.S.-Soviet enforcement of the ceasefire, but threatened that if the United States did not cooperate, the USSR would act unilaterally. Moreover, it appeared that Moscow was already on the move. The CIA reported that the Soviet airlift of equipment had stopped that morning and that the Soviet transport planes were apparently being refitted to fly in Soviet paratroopers to impose Brezhnev's peace offer. Kissinger wrote, quote, "There was no question in my mind that we would have to reject the Soviet proposal in a manner that shocked the Soviets into abandoning the unilateral move they were threatening, and from all our information, planning," end quote. And as Nixon later wrote, quote, "Words were not making our point. We needed action, even the action of a military alert," end quote. But what exactly was Brezhnev planning? U.S. intelligence had been wrong before about the Kremlin's intentions, most famously during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and had also failed to predict the Arab attack. Kissinger pointed to what he called ominous reports, which we now know, thanks to the recent declassification of the president's daily briefs. Reports referred to intelligence that Moscow was transferring nuclear warheads to Egypt by sea. Kissinger was worried that the escalating crisis was about to go nuclear. Admiral Thomas Moore, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, who was at the late-night White House meeting that produced the DEFCON alert, was not so sure. He wrote later, quote, "I pointed out that the military indicators might lead one to believe that this was a premeditated action on the parts of the Soviets," end quote. Professor Naftali said, quote, the U.S. intelligence community was having a hard time separating noise from signals, as is often the case for any intelligence surface. And Kissinger, its main consumer of intelligence information, was excitable, end quote. Harvard historian Frederick Logevall wrote, quote, because President Nixon was preoccupied with Watergate, Kissinger had more latitude to act on his own than in previous crises. Indeed, at several moments, he and White House Chief of Staff Alexander Haig acted without even consulting Nixon, end quote. The specter of Armageddon, including the still vivid memory of the Cuban Missile Crisis, hung over the White House Situation Room on the night of October 24th, 1973. Kissinger wanted a dramatic gesture suggesting that the United States was willing to go to the brink of world war to prevent the Soviets from doing whatever they were planning to do. It was time to go to Roundhouse, DEFCON 3. All U.S. forces worldwide were then placed on DEFCON 3. Martin Indyk, a former U.S. ambassador to Israel, writing in his book in 2021, quote, the alert was still an inadequate signal. Channeling his inner Nixon, Kissinger told the group that when you decide to use force, you must use plenty of it, end quote. To ensure Moscow got the hint, Kissinger also decided to transfer 2 U.S. aircraft carrier task forces to the Mediterranean and recalled 75 nuclear-armed B-52 bombers from Guam to the continental United States. Naftali said, quote, I believe Kissinger panicked, blaming Nixon's Watergate problems and not his own management of the Israelis, who had clearly violated the ceasefire, whatever the Egyptians were up to. Kissinger thought the only way to show toughness was to send as strong a message as President Kennedy had sent in the Cuban Missile Crisis years earlier, although the geopolitical situations were not equivalent, end quote. One major difference was that the American populace was unaware of the missile crisis. After all, President John Kennedy had called Moscow's nuclear bluff on national television. One major difference was that the American populace was aware of the missile crisis. After all, President John Kennedy had called Moscow's nuclear bluff on national television. The country was largely in the dark about the DEFCON alert in 1973. Meanwhile, the American military scrambled into action. Steve Winkle, a navigator on one of the activated B-52s in Guam, remembered getting a phone call telling troops to report to the briefing room. He told Air and Space magazine in 2014, referring to the Strategic Air Command, quote, then the lights went out, and we heard Strategic Air Command is in DEFCON 3. The room went totally silent, end quote. Robert Rubel, the pilot of a Naval Air Force's A-7 Corsair, was already aloft above the Mediterranean, checking the activity of the Soviet fleet. Rubel, who later became Dean of the Naval Warfare Center of the Naval War College, told Air and Space magazine also in 2014, quote, our job was to keep an eye on the decks. If we saw the smoke of a missile launch, we'd send a Zippo report back, as in, hey, World War III is on. The idea was that we'd get that report out before we died, end quote. In case that happened, Rubel and his fellow A-7 pilots planned to descend on the enemy ships and unleash their 500-pound bombs, like U.S. Navy aviator Wade McCluskey dive-bombing the Japanese carriers at Midway in World War II. Fortunately, World War III was not on. All these actions culminated in the most desirable response possible from the American perspective. The Soviets were utterly shocked by the U.S.'s escalated yet calculated response, and Anwar Sadat did indeed rescind his request for Soviet troops. That same day, October 25th, UN Resolution 340 was approved, ending the war. But the question remains, was the alert justified? Naftali thinks not, judging by all the evidence now available. He said, quote, Brezhnev decided the best response was to ignore DEFCON 3, since the Soviets had never planned to intervene, end quote. Acton of the Carnegie Endowment agreed that some of the intelligence, including the report about the Soviet freighter supposedly carrying the nukes to Egypt, was a mirage, not least because the CIA backed away from the claim within days of making it. 50 years later, the world now watches in horror as the sequel to the first Yom Kippur War plays itself out. Although tensions between Washington and Moscow have once again risen in recent years, there appears to be little likelihood of their nuclear forces going to the brink again, at least not over Israel. But, of course, there is always the possibility that the two superpowers can get their signal once again, as they did in 1973. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. You know, the Progressive Voices Network brings you commercial-free commentary from today's leading progressive radio hosts and pundits, like me, Mike Malloy, 24 hours a day. I'm not your typical old guy from the 80s or the 90s talk radio host, and Progressive Voices is not your typical talk radio network. It's a listener-supported nonprofit with no corporate control whatsoever over our broadcast. So hosts like me, Mike Malloy, are free to rant and scream and carry on about whatever we like. We're often controversial, but we're never boring. Weeknights, 9 p.m. in the East, 6 p.m. in the West on the Progressive Voices Network. Always progressive, always on. I'm Mike Malloy. Keep it lit.